Astronauts are conducting a quantum mechanics experiment on the International Space Station to discover a new state of matter that could change the life of all humanity. However, they accidentally release something into the real world, analogous to the unfortunate Schrodinger's cat.
Hello, baby.
In the first frames of the film, a woman drives a car along a nighttime highway. Suddenly, the voice of an unknown woman speaking Russian comes from the radio. Jo translates for her daughter Alice that she believes the world has turned upside down. Then a police car appears behind them, and an unknown device next to Jo starts blinking alarmingly. However, the police pass by. Soon, the pair arrives at a small house. Jo lights a fire and puts the child to bed. Then she goes outside to check the device in the car, but hears her daughter's scream and returns to the house. However, Alice is sleeping. Jo runs outside again, hears her daughter's scream again, and runs off into the night. 5 weeks earlier, Jo floats in zero gravity as part of a group of astronauts on the International Space Station. Jo sees her daughter and husband, Magnus, only via video call, and she conducts the next session from the cold nuclear fusion laboratory, where Mission Commander Paul is adjusting the equipment according to the orders of scientist Henry Calder from Earth. The scientists are searching for a new state of matter, but no one knows what it is. Suddenly, something crashes into the space station. Communication with Earth is lost, a fire breaks out, the commander's hand is trapped, and one of the Soyuz spacecraft is seriously damaged. Roscosmos takes over the repairs while the mission's doctor amputates Paul's hand. Henry insists on saving the capsule with the cold fusion experiment results. Meanwhile, Jo goes out into open space to inspect the crash site, unaware that Paul's heart stops. Suddenly, the video link with Jo is lost, and the center can only hear her communications. Then, she sees the cause of the accident in front of her, the desiccated body of a female astronaut in an orange suit with the inscription USSR. Jo tries to catch it, but the space mummy flies off into space. Jo tells her colleague about everything, and Roscosmos head Irina hears it on Earth. Learning of the commander's death, the center orders 3 mission members to fly to Earth on Soyuz 2, while Jo fixes Soyuz 1 and returns on it. The spacecraft is set to emergency mode. Jo sketches the body she saw, sends it to the center, and starts repairs. Irina informs Henry that she ordered his equipment to be left on the station as it may have caused the accident, but he argues that the experiment could change the life of all humanity and must be retrieved. The astronauts returning on Soyuz 2 are greeted on Earth. Jo is asked to retrieve the capsule with the experiment results, after which the communication is lost. Suddenly, she hears knocking from the side of the closed station, makes her way there, opens the door, and finds herself in the corridor of a typical Earth building. In front of her are doors someone is knocking on, and her daughter's necklace hangs on the doorknob. But then Jo finds herself back on the station and hears Alice's scream. The woman turns around and returns to the snowy field from the first frames of the film, approaching the house. Jo goes up to the second floor and sees a closet with Alice's necklace hanging on the handle. Inside, the girl sits, unable to understand where her mother has been. Jo carries the girl into the house and suddenly confesses that Alice smells like herself. The mother puts the child in the bathtub, but steps away and turning back, sees Alice sleeping in bed with no one in the bathroom. The girl hugs her, but Jo declares that she is not her daughter, and Jo finds herself back on the ISS again. Back on Earth, Henry brings equipment to Baikonur for a rescue mission, but Irina reports that there are no signs of life on the station. However, Jo is alive and continues repairing the equipment, resting in the shuttle where Paul's body lies. Later, she records a message to her family, but unexpectedly hears a male voice asking her not to breathe. She rushes to the laboratory door, opens it, and sees Paul reaching out to her. Jo shakes it and immediately realizes it's the commander's severed limb. Meanwhile, on Earth, Henry leverages all his contacts to send a rescue mission to the station, refusing to talk about his twin brother. At the same time, his twin brother, Pat Caldera, is on vacation on a cruise liner, answering a journalist's questions about his spaceflight, and snaps at the woman who confuses him with his brother. Jo restores the power supply to Soyuz 1 and returns for the cold fusion capsule. Finally, she records a message to her family and launches the shuttle. Unexpectedly, the automatic undocking fails. Manual undocking from inside the station is required. In despair, Jo punches the control panel while someone's shadow approaches the internal control panel, and the system activates. The shuttle heads to Earth, where Jo was already considered dead. Soon, the module lands in a deserted steppe where rescuers find Jo, helping her out. They place the woman on a stretcher and carry her to the helicopter. However, Alice rushes to her, and Jo, smiling happily, embraces her daughter and husband, who seems unable to believe that his wife is genuinely happy to see him. Henry retrieves the capsule, and Jo is carried into the helicopter, where her family already sits. Suddenly, Jo finds herself alone in the empty machine, but everything quickly returns to normal, and the woman decides it's the result of stress. She speaks to her daughter in Swedish, but she does not understand her. Henry celebrates the successful results of the quantum mechanics experiment conducted on the ISS. The scene shifts back to the Winter house, where Jo demands her daughter back. Alice is frightened by her mother's strange behavior, but then she runs out the door, taking the cold fusion capsule with her and claiming they need to find another Alice. Present time, Jo is recovering after the flight. During a press conference one day, Jo expresses sympathy to the wife of the deceased astronaut Paul, and suddenly it turns out that the woman's name is different. Henry demonstrates the results of the experiment he received here on Earth. However, his assistant is convinced that such a thing is only possible in space and that it's merely a glitch. At Baikonur, an investigation into the tragedy begins. The commission reviews the orbit footage, but when Jo mentions the object that caused the accident, the body of a Soviet female astronaut, nobody believes her, as there has never been a report of a missing astronaut, especially a female, in the history of space exploration. Later, Jo receives vitamin tablets that she must take every day. She tries to get closer to her husband, not noticing that he seems to be avoiding her, and her daughter Alice keeps her distance from her mother. The next day, Jo again appears before the commission, which tries to convince her that the station collided with an orange garbage bag. After the meeting, her boss Frederick tries to hug her, but she steps back in confusion. He doesn't understand why she has forgotten everything that happened between them. Scared, Jo returns to her husband in tears, confesses her love for him, and they become intimate. Meanwhile, Henry talks to Alice and tells her about the thought experiment from quantum mechanics about Schrödinger's cat. Scientists long believed that the world was governed by the laws of classical physics. But then came geniuses like Einstein, who discovered that the same substance could exist in two forms. For example, a particle in one world is black and in another it's white. And there's a space between worlds where this particle is both black and white simultaneously. It doesn't want to choose what it will be until someone looks at it. Henry invented equipment that was taken into space and discovered something, but it seems it doesn't want to come out into the light. Meanwhile, Magnus admits that his wife is completely different. Then Henry arrives, deciding to thank Jo for saving the capsule. She remembers that he worked on the Apollo mission, and the old man warns that people who have been through space often change. Later, the team goes to a memorial alley, and Jo shows her friends a photo of the spacesuit she saw in space. But they tell her that the photo shows Irina, who is now the director of the Flight Control Center. Soon, colleagues reach a tree planted by Commander Paul before the flight and lay flowers. But when Jo is left alone, she suddenly sees Paul himself, who tells her that his heart is still hanging in space. After this, Jo admits the commission is right and retracts her original statements. Her family heads home, where Jo senses some discrepancies. For example, their car is blue, but Jo remembers their car was red. The action shifts back to a winter night, where Alice tries to persuade Jo to come back because she thinks her mother sees things that don't exist. And suddenly she asks for her mother back. Present time. The family congratulates Jo on the past Christmas and birthday. She jokes and laughs, although Magnus admits he was sure their marriage was over. In the morning, Jo walks around the house and suddenly sees a piano. She sits down in front of it and opens the sheet music. In the evening, Jo notices again that her daughter doesn't understand her Swedish, although before the flight, the girl spoke it fluently. Meanwhile, Magnus confesses that he knew about her affair with a colleague, Frederick. This perplexes Jo, as it is not true. At the same time, Henry recalls a formula where lithium-7 serves as the main component in combating stress. Meanwhile, Jo visits a psychologist who prescribes her an antidepressant, lithium. Upon leaving, she is noticed by Henry, who invites her to see his laboratory, where he talks about astronauts who, after their flight, heard non-existent sounds and smells. However, this is usually kept quiet. Then Henry reports to the management that in the center of the cold fusion laboratory, using lasers and magnets, he obtained an image identical to that obtained during the quantum physics experiment aboard the ISS. He attempted to capture the moment when a substance is in two different states simultaneously. That very experiment with the unfortunate Schrödinger's cat, which can't be determined whether it's alive or dead. But only Henry sees the experimental results. Apparently, this demonstrates the observer effect, and in turn, the experiment affects the experimenter. Meanwhile, Jo approaches the piano again, but this time she starts to play, and she scares herself with this because she never knew how to play. The next day, Jo compares the vitamins received at Baikonur with the prescribed medication. She confirms that both contain lithium-7. Unexpectedly, she sees two workers, from whom she hides in an office, where she finds a list of astronauts. Next to each name are letters, and checking those under the letter B, like herself, she discovers lithium-7 prescribed to all, and evidence that they all saw unusual things. At this time, the workers enter the office and, ignoring her, start to pack folders onto a cart. She tries to get their attention, but it's as if she doesn't exist. She stands and approaches a man closely. He screams and disappears. Jo is alone in the office again. She goes to Henry's office, but he suddenly accuses her of excessive curiosity, which will doom her. Later, her colleague Frederick comes to her, not understanding what happened, as they loved each other. But Jo avoids the conversation. At home, Jo finds an envelope on the table containing tapes. It turns out the workers of the Marine Observatory, unlike the Flight Control Center, heard her calls from space and recorded them, and now they've sent them to her. Jo plays the tapes and hears her own voice when Alice comes down to the living room, but sees in front of her a hall filled with grieving people, the living astronaut Paul with his family, and in the center, a portrait of Jo in a mourning frame. She screams, but her father takes the daughter upstairs, where the wife confesses that all her pills are neuroleptics. This means they've been deliberately habituating her to them. She is convinced that they heard her, but intentionally wanted to leave her to certain death in space. Magnus reaches for the phone to have his wife taken for treatment, but Jo pushes him and the man falls and hits the floor. Jo pulls herself together, calls an ambulance, and asks her daughter to get in the car. On the way, she stops by the laboratory and steals a flask with the substance obtained in orbit during the quantum physics experiment. Henry hears a knock at the door, but when he opens it, the corridor is empty. The scientist closes the door, not noticing his twin brother Pat, who suddenly appeared behind him and then disappeared. But then he receives a call from Irina. She has just read an article about two particles that quantum mechanics allows to exist in two entangled states. What happens to one particle in the entangled pair determines what happens to the other, even if they are far apart. Without responding, he hangs up the phone. Meanwhile, Jo manages to contact a Russian cosmonaut, Ilya, to find out what specific vitamins were given to him on the ISS. He reads off a name starting with the letter A. The woman shares that unlike the rest of the crew, she was given neuroleptics. The cosmonaut is somewhat skeptical, but she asks him to check his pills and wait for her call. At this time, Henry discovers the disappearance of a flask. The next morning, Jo asks her daughter to elaborate on her fears. The girl confesses that she hears the voice of an unknown woman named Valia. Jo steps away to call the person from the observatory who sent her the tapes, but he suddenly claims it couldn't be her and hangs up. Meanwhile, Alice brings her a drawing of her fear, and it's the figure of a female astronaut in an orange spacesuit whom Jo saw dead in space. At this time, Ilya checks his pills, and they turn out to be vitamins, but documents on the substances given to Jo are no longer accessible. Meanwhile, Jo arrives at the Marine Observatory, where she meets the brother and sister who sent her the tapes. The elderly couple clearly heard her voice from space and recorded it on their father's equipment. They are ready to demonstrate the recordings, but they can only be heard by going out to sea. The couple takes Jo and Alice to a boat, talking about strange cases when people saw something unusual in space, like angels. And often, upon returning home, they would go mad. They wrote everything down, but there was little noise until Apollo 18. During this mission, the ether was literally packed, but decrypting these messages is very difficult. The ship sails from the shore, and the woman plays a tape recorded in 1967. It contains the voice of a female cosmonaut returning to Earth in a malfunctioning capsule, apparently perishing. On that day, Irina flew into space and supposedly returned unharmed, and she can also let her listen to the voice of Paul, although everyone says he died. But Jo refuses to listen. They sail back to shore when Alice secretly calls her father and tells him where her mom is taking her, and the woman hands over the tapes to Jo. Mother and daughter drive to a forest cabin, analyzing everything that happened along the way. Alice plays the tape from 1967 again and recognizes the voice of Valia, who comes to her in visions. The woman is in pain and very hot, and it's clearly audible. Henry, looking in the mirror, calls his twin brother, and when Pat appears in the reflection, accuses him of stopping taking his pills and admits that his experience in space made everything worse. Jo and Alice continue to listen to Valia's voice, who says that the world has turned upside down. Upon reaching the house, Jo plays the recording of her conversation with Alice before the collision, but suddenly the girl declares that it wasn't her because she doesn't speak Swedish. The action shifts to the ISS on the day the accident occurred. Only this time, the other side of the Schrodinger's cat experiment manifests, in which Paul survives. Commander Paul conducts a quantum physics experiment, and Jo is talking to Alice when an alarm sounds. Jo is thrown against the porthole, she hits her head hard and loses consciousness. Paul tries to assist her, but realizes that the woman is dead. Her husband and daughter are informed of this terrible news, and they fly to Baikonur. Meanwhile, in orbit, Paul remains to repair the shuttle, distressed that it's impossible to enter the laboratory, meaning the experiment's results will remain in orbit. Joe's body is transferred to the shuttle, but Paul cannot believe the reality of her death. Later, he rests before landing, recording messages. Again, he feels as if Joe is alive. He even asks her not to breathe. Then he contacts Houston, reports the nature of the body's damage, transfers her from the ship to the space station's compartment, and locks her there. Later, he prepares for undocking, but the system doesn't respond. The Flight Control Center reminds him that undocking requires two people. Paul, like Joe in another reality, hits the console while someone's shadow approaches the internal control panel, and the system activates. The shuttle lands safely. Paul is met by his family, but he cannot forget what happened and feels guilty for leaving Joe's body on the ISS. He goes to her tree and, laying flowers, suddenly sees Joe in front of him. They look at each other for a moment, but then she disappears. Later, he tells Joe's family how she died when suddenly he sees his portrait in a mourning frame. He is distracted by questions about visiting a psychologist and comes to his senses. Later, the astronaut appears before a commission and talks about the experiment and the accident. Suddenly, the crew members object. They know nothing about any quantum physics experiment. This project was closed 12 years ago, and he also did not receive orders to leave Joe's body in orbit. It was his decision. Alice struggles greatly with the loss of her mother, especially since the girl constantly feels that something is not right. Meanwhile, Paul reviews footage from the Apollo 18 mission and is surprised to learn that 2 astronauts died during the launch under Henry Caldera's command. He goes to his boss, but she only knows Pat Caldera. There was no equipment and no Nobel Prize. Apollo 18 was NASA's biggest failure. The man returns to his family and finds that his wife's name is different from what he remembers. Later, his family goes to Joe's house to participate in the memorial service, but Alice again sits in the closet and refuses to come out, believing that her mom is alive. Paul, seeing his crew, does not want to enter the house, but his wife convinces him, although the husband admits that everything around is not right. Then his daughter brings Alice. He turns his head and sees another Alice who screams at what is happening in the living room. Joe runs to the scream, seeing Alice from Paul's reality, and tries to shout to her mother. Magnus takes the daughter away and she asks him to take her to her mom's house. The next day, Magnus and Alice go to the lake house. At night, the father suddenly confesses that he cannot understand his daughter, who assures that they will see Joe again. Meanwhile, Paul arrives at the house of Henry's twin brother, Pat, calls him Henry, and reports that he conducted experiments under his supervision. He wants to know the truth at any cost, but Pat pulls out a gun and shoots him. At the same time, Alice sees a car approaching the cabin, from which Joe steps out. This concludes the 6th episode of the new series from Apple, titled Constellation. The film is for the patient viewer, and it's hard to predict what will happen in the next episodes.